Welcome, everybody. This is Dr. Terrence Duncan, and we're going to discuss Module 7 of 8 of the Dissertation Journey. And the title of Module 7 is The Tactics to Select a Research Design. And you're going to learn how to develop a design approach for your dissertation study. The objectives of this particular module are as follows. You're going to distinguish the selection process between qualitative and quantitative methods. You will also learn how to utilize research literature to establish the rationale towards a methodological approach. You will also learn to distinguish the difference between the qualitative and quantitative methods to designate your research design for your dissertation study. And you will also learn the essentialist approach towards research. You may recall several of the key points from Module 6, and they include the following. You learned how to avoid bias in selecting the study methodology. You also learned how to recognize benefits of mixed methods in the research, as well as understanding the benefits and challenges of the singular method selection in your research. Develop an approach towards a methodology selection. Very important to be able to do the research design that's going to connect to your problem statement, which connects to your overall dissertation proposal or your dissertation study. Um, to do so, you have to develop an approach that involves identification of some of the following key traits. One is the desired research methodology. The second is to learn how to connect the methodology to the research design, as well as justifying the scope of the research design. Does it match? It's like the match game. As a scholar practitioner, using this particular models address the more specific needs within a specific industry. One thing to note is that it develops the research and the recommendations to address systemic challenges. Snyder had noted that the reviews conducted by other researchers and by conducting lit reviews may lack thoroughness and rigor, as well as not to follow a specific methodology. So basically what Snyder is saying is that although that students are taught to conduct literature reviews to support the problem statement or the selection of the research design and the scope of the study, the process of how the lit review is being conducted may have a lack of thoroughness involved, as well as there may not be a concise method in the approach for the literature review, which ultimately affects the development of the research design as well as the connectivity to the problem statement. Different approaches produce different results. Merging different approaches may provide a more robust analysis and results. Different constructs based on the method may provide a more intrinsic response to the specific research problem. The results may produce different perspectives and agendas, according to Kearney 2013. Henders had provided a very good quote, which I thought was helpful for this particular module, and it included that the researchers may not share a common set of perceptions, meaning that what you may see as far as one particular problem is affected may be viewed based on your particular perspective or viewpoint. However, another scholar could come right behind you, look at the same set of problems, and have a different way to address those particular set of perceptions. Want to focus on the scholar practitioner model because it does marry the two different sets of ideologies in developing your research approach. And just one thing to keep in note is that the scholar practitioner models does combine different approaches from different researchers. They also provide a more robust, and they also learn how to tailor the research questions as well as the study to address the specifics of a problem, and it combines theoretical and practical application towards research design. You may recall from prior modules and based on subsequent reading that the benefit of being a scholar practitioner is that you actually have more direct experience, you have more of a vested interest into some of the problems that may exist in a particular industry or in a particular field, and that you're taking your particular expertise from the field and combining that with a level of academic rigor to help develop the research design as well as help develop the research questions for your dissertation. Scope relevancy. Sometimes you may hear about what is the scope of the problem, what is the scope of the study itself. You think about it, the dissertation is a broader sense, and what you're doing when you're working on the problem statement and the research design is that you're narrowing it down. And this is basically like the oil in a car, where the oil and the gas in a car. If you don't have those two filled properly, the car is not going to operate at a maximum efficiency. So what you want to do is to make sure is that you have the right type of oil as well as the right type of gas in that particular car, and it's no different from your dissertation. So scope relevancy, several questions you want to ask yourself. I'm not going to go through each one of them, but you want to look at, does the literature review address the above questions designated by the research? So do you have the research questions, or are you developing the research questions, and does the research questions have some form of a structure or support that comes from the actual lit review? How can the desired research method address gaps in the literature? What is a gap in the literature? You have to ask yourself while you are developing your study, uh, where are the gaps, and how have the gaps been identified? Is the gaps identified by systemic research, or is it just something where you say, aha, I think there's a gap in this particular area, and this is where I'm going to design my study. You have to you have to remember that anything involving your dissertation and anything that's at a high academic level has to be supported by, grounded by strong literature review that connects to the central problem as well as the research design. Which is better? You'll have an argument for some that will do qualitative. You'll have some that may prefer to do quantitative. You may have some that does mixed methods. It doesn't really matter which is the best. There's actually not a best design, but it has to be relevant to this. Go back to the scope. It has to be relevant to the scope of the research process. It has to go back to the scope of the dissertation. It has to go back to the gaps of the literature. And if they're all connect, then you have a valid method selection for a method design for your research. Remove personal perceptions and bias from the selection process. You have to ask yourself as a researcher, what steps did you take as a researcher to remove or mitigate against bias? Did you validate your reasoning and assumption in your research? If you get to, as you get later on into the dissertation, there's a section that's involves with the assumptions and limitations. You can't make the assumptions, limitations, and pull them out of thin air. You have to be able to support that with viable research, and that other researchers had looked at this particular type of problem or this particular type of method research design and said, okay, here are the limitations and here are the assumptions. But one thing you have to understand is that regardless of who you're paired with, as far as your dissertation chair or a committee member, or even somebody that have another set of eyes looking at your paper, you as the researcher maintains the final responsibility about the feasibility of the study. Other people can provide input, people can provide feedback, but ultimately it is up to the researcher to have the responsibility to ensure that the study is feasible and that the study is valid. Speaking of validation, we're going to talk about validating assumption and methods. Several ways to do so is that in areas in qualitative research, you want to have a respondent validation. You want to have the feedback. Does the information, is the response received validated by the research? Have you accounted for personal biases? Have you examined a construct in any qualifiers? Ask why. Why is this particular assumption valid for this particular research design? Or is there any other subsequent literature out there that you can use that can help provide further validation and also serve the purpose to remove bias in developing the research design? Everything about the dissertation proposal is very systematic, and you have to have a systematic approach to the research questions as well. And your research, the approach to the research question is dependent on the student's research and inferences from the independent research. So again, this ties back to the literature review. If you are looking at something that's closed-ended and structured, something that's a little bit more objective and deductive, then you want to lean towards the quantitative method. If you are looking at something that's more open-ended and methodologically the methodological development of the research questions, you want to focus more on the qualitative side. The reason being is because it addresses the depths of perceptions, feelings, and thoughts. Either way, the study should signal the approach to the selection through the articulation of the research conducted. Again, it goes back to the literature review. What did the literature say? What other studies have used similar theories? And to validate, to be able to provide validation for your particular study design. There are differences towards their approach and several questions, and there's numerous questions, but some of the key questions to ask yourself includes, what is the basis of appeal towards a particular method that you selected? Is the selected design more appropriate than another? And you have to ask yourself why. You see the word why come up a lot, not only in this module, but something that you'll probably hear from your dissertation chair, or even just as you as a researcher. You always have to continue to ask yourself why. And if there is a why, you should be able to have an answer or a subset of answers. Another question to ask yourself is, does the action research produce several articles to justify the scope of design? So here's the word scope again. And a common theme from the prior modules includes the action research. What did the action research say? The essentialist approach, I thought that was a pretty good approach to go ahead and include in this particular module. And what the essentialist approach entails is that certain properties are essential compared to accidental or contingent, according to Given 2008. And the essentialist approach is simplified and is taught from elementary to university learning. And it is a shift from approach developing and graduate learning. So basically, when you go through elementary school, you're pretty much taught one way. Everybody is almost like sheep. You're herded in one direction to have one singular approach towards learning. As you get to the bachelor level, you still kind of somewhat shepherded into a singular approach to learning. Graduate level is about as effective as the professor that you have and the emphasis that the professor has at your graduate school. So for those working on a master, or for those that had completed a master's, you're going to probably have a variation of different approaches towards research, but in a larger sense, it's still an essentialist approach. It's very centralized. But in the doctoral learning, your approach actually shifts, and so that's where you start seeing different viewpoints, different perspectives. There is a plethora of approaches that is available, and it's very much recommended to try to identify what approach is best suited for you, the way that you approach a research question or the way that you may approach a study, because they may have some keys in helping designing your dissertation. Challenges to the essentialist approach includes that it denies the value of the classification criteria. Arguments between the two methods are hardened, and it lacks openness to the variations of approach. So when you are looking at a particular research question or research problem, the one thing that you want to do, again, you really want to look at different levels of approach towards a research problem. So under the essentialist approach, if you do not have the openness, you don't have the variation. If you don't have the variation, then you get kind of locked in or placed in this little box as far as the scope of how you're going to design your research. And that scope is so narrow that you're not able to see probably other qualifiers or any other theoretical constructs that could help boost the rationale of your study. Provided some alternatives from the essentialist approach, and they include the recognition of shared values. It teaches you how to think different variations of how to play Monopoly. Monopoly was an approach used in a particular research for this particular module. And Monopoly, if you ask somebody how to play Monopoly, you're going to have probably about 10 to 15 different variations of Monopoly. And the same thing applies for this particular approach. So what you want to do is identify whatever is the best method of selection for yourself for that particular study. And then you, like I said, you continue to build the support with action research, strong literature review, and ensuring that you're identifying gaps in the literature. And that concludes Module 7 of the dissertation journey. Module 8 will actually feature a cumulative review of every module rolled up into one. So some of the slides will be very similar. However, we take everything from the first module from the dissertation journey, and then we put it all together to ensure that you have the tools that you need to be able to develop a dissertation, or at least the first chapter of your dissertation. So thank you for listening to the module, and I wish you the best of luck.